Yes, the subject today will be why DNA in Jews, and it's well, it's for the Sephardic world. So let me check. Yes. Well, at the moment we're doing this as part of the paternal project, headed by Adam Brown, and also together with Michael Waas and Raquel Levi Toledano, and with the four of us, we administrator the project and collect and analyze the data of, well, lots of Jewish regions in the world. For my own background, I started in 2014 looking for Ashkenazi branches, and as Don already said, this was the result of having a J1 lineage, and I was curious where that J1 could come from. So I had a look at the public Y-DNA of Jewish people, since that could be an origin of my J1, I thought at that time. So I collected data and I sorted out lots of Y-DNA data, and which resulted in a website which I called jewishdna.net. And it appeared that these Ashkenazi branches had a fairly small number of ancestors. So their male line ancestors had a fairly small number, much smaller than I expected at that time. Well, this resulted in 2016 to collaborate in the Avotaynu project, where data was collected from Sephardic and other Jewish groups. Since those groups were not strongly present in the public data sets, but the contacts of Adam, Michael, and Raquel helped to collect data in those communities, which strongly enriched all the data that we had available. So at the moment, we consider our total set of data having 680 branches, and which, if they are all confirmed, at the moment they are grouped, and we think that most of them are, or almost all of them, will have a Jewish proven ancestor, and so that will end up at the moment for 680. And of course, as more data will come in, that number probably will go up somewhat. But in the project, we already noticed that adding more data now often adds more people to known lineages we already have measured before. So the subject of today is how do we determine the branches? And I'll go step by step on aspects which play a role in this analysis. Now, the first, what do we want to do? We want to find these male line ancestors of the Jewish population. So we make a step from genealogy to history. And genealogy, I mean using old documents and really finding ancestors, as this is an example where we have used documents of birth and marriage and death used to find out how lineages are concerned. And often, this is an American example of Coriel, from recent publications where Adam and Michael contributed strongly. This goes back from roughly 1700 to 1900. But of course, there was a period before that, and we don't have genealogy data which is of sufficient quality to know what happened before. But luckily, we do have DNA data which can help us to. We now know that this will expand to a period before that. So here this is 850 before the Common Era, and at that moment a SNP was measured. I'll come later back to what that means exactly. But it means roughly that here have an ancestor which descending lineages in the male line, and then we have a descending lineages, and again we have branch splits with different brothers and male lineages. Then If we go to DNA data, what do we know and what can we learn from the DNA markers on the male lines? Now, to remind some of you what you know of DNA, the basic set is we have 46 chromosomes in our DNA. There are 22 autosomal sets, and we have an X and a Y chromosome. So this is the X and the Y. Now, all these chromosomes, except for the Y, are mixed from parents. So the autosomal you have partly from your father and partly from your mother. So we don't know really which element comes from where. And for the X, this is the same thing. But if it's a Y chromosome, we know it goes from father to father. If nothing would change, it would be identical. So my father's Y DNA would be exactly the same as my Y DNA if it was passed on as a complete copy. Now, it is not a complete copy. So now and then a small mutation takes place, which helps us a lot in finding this genealogy, this genetic genealogy. The size of this Y chromosome is like 62 million base pairs. So it has 62 million positions on this DNA. Now, for this analysis, we can only use 15 million, but that's still a nice number and sufficiently large to do good work. We also have a mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to children. But this is extremely much smaller. It's a factor of 1,000 smaller, which means that the statistical accuracy we have is also much less. So we can do work with it, but it's not as accurate as we learned from the Y DNA lineages. So here is again a classical example. What can we do from the DNA data? Here is the autosomal, partly from father and from mother, and split in parts again from and going back in time. For the daughter line, we can use the mitochondrial DNA, and for the Y DNA, we use the male lineages. So we go from son to dad to grandfather to great grandfather and so on. Now, the first type of mutations I will mention is the STR mutation. Now, in this case, I give an example of a small piece of these 15 million positions. Now, all these positions consist of only 3 types of elements, nucleotides, which is an A, it's a C, it's a G, or a T. And then they are sequenced one after another. Now, there are 15 million of them on the Y chromosome. And in this diagram, I only show you about 600 of them, just to give you an impression. And of course, if we see this from the start, we see nothing because we have no idea what it means, what the impact is. And in generally, the small details differences have no impact at all. However, if sometimes there are small changes from father to son. Now, for example, now you see something changing on the screen if you're watching, but the change was small. And to highlight what changed, I gave here a sequence. This is AGAT, and this is called an STR. So this AGAT is repeated several times. In this case, AGAT, AGAT, AGAT. In this time, it's repeated 12 times. And in the mutation that I showed you between the 2 diagrams, it went from 12 to 13. So there's a tiny change, this repeat of AGAT, which happens more often than other mutations. And the nice thing is we can fairly well measure it. So in this case, this AGAT stands for STR with the name this 393. And in this case, it went from 12 to 13. So that means that if my father would have 12 and I have 13, and we compare this Y chromosome, we see this tiny, tiny difference. The nice thing is it's fairly easy to measure. And the other thing is that we also have some fairly good knowledge of how often it mutates. Now, it doesn't mutate very often. Like in this case, it's about 0.1% per generation. So if this would be 1, it would be 1%. So this is 0.1%. So in 1,000 generations, it will be one change. And now one of the nice things is that this is the STR, this 393, and there are other STRs which have a different set of characters here, sequencing, and they have a different mutation rate. And the nice thing is we can measure several of these STRs. And something which is fairly often measured is 37 or 67 of these numbers. In this case, I show you
You're mute, Wim. You're muted. No sound.
okay. Where can I change it? Can I change it, or is it something else?
We can hear you now.
Okay.
Froze for a bit.
Okay. I was not aware I touched something, but I saw something on the screen which says that I have a bad connection, which is surprising, but I'll just continue. I was saying we have these STRs. In this case, these are 67, sometimes 37 are measured. And this first one, for example, is this 393, which I just mentioned. And then this is another one, this is another one. So we have all these numbers. And now if we compare people, we can see that if people have a shared ancestor, a recent shared ancestor, then probably all these 67 numbers are the same. But if we have a shared ancestors, for example, 10 generations ago, then it's likely that 1, 2, maybe 3 of these numbers have changed. And in the next diagram, I show you a set of Ashkenazi people who have STR values which are fairly close to each other. Now, in this case, on the top line, you see the model, which is the value for each STR which is most common. As you see also, here we have an STR which is the same for everyone. So this is likely an STR which has a very slow mutation rate. It hardly ever changes. But this CDY has a very high mutation rate, and you see there are many green dots which indicates that they're different from the most common value in this group. In this case, this horizontal line, this blue one on the top, is probably the STR values of the ancestor of this whole group. So this is probably from somebody who lived, well, maybe 1500 years ago. At the moment, we don't know yet, but we'll try to calculate roughly how long ago it is. So we see this value and we see all differences. Now, the first person, somebody from Belarus, apparently has 2 positions, 2 STRs, which are different. The second person has about 6. And the third in this line has only 1. The fourth has also 1. And whether it's 1, 2, 3, 5, or 6 strongly depends on time. The longer the time scale is, the more mutations. But it's also a statistical process. So sometimes it happens fast, and sometimes it happens a little slower, just like a Geiger teller. It's a statistical situation. But there is an average which we can determine. So, for example, this first one had a distance of 2 to the model. So what we do is we take this value of 2 and we plot it in a diagram at the position of 2. Then we do the same thing for the second one, which had a distance of 6. And then we do the third one, which had a distance of 1. And then the fourth one. And we do this for all these different lines we had in our diagram. And as you see, if we have these, we make this measure, then we see that there's a range. It doesn't go above 12 or so. It's hardly ever 1, but there's in the middle there's something which is the most common number of mutation. And this is also then the average number of mutations which we expect from that time period. Now in this case, the last two were number 8 and number 9, so we added that 2, and then we have this diagram. And from this diagram, which is this diagram is the same here, you see here, we can determine what is the most number of mutations which is most common. And we can do some simulations with different, the 67 STRs. And from that, we can determine how many generations ago this likely what this ancestor lived. And we know that if the ancestor would have lived, in this case, this is roughly between 670 and 860 in the Common Era. If that person would have lived much longer ago, then the number of mutations would have been higher. So we would not have had a diagram which had a maximum at 5, but maybe at 7 or 8. And if the ancestor had lived much more recent, for example, only 1,000 years ago, then the number of mutations on average would have been gone to 4 or 3. So this is a way to determine, on average, the ancestor lived. Another thing you can see here is that those people who they indicate also in which country they lived, and the majority of these people lived in Eastern Europe, which is no surprise, but it's good to confirm that this data is fitting. And we also see some exceptions. In this case, we see the exceptions are mainly other countries and unknown. So we don't learn much. We have a smaller number in Germanic countries in the red. And at the larger distance, if we go here, then they have probably a shared ancestor, which is many thousands of years ago. So that's probably like 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So here they are very far away. So this is recognition of one Ashkenazi branch, and this whole group, which is a very large group, has one shared ancestor. If we take a modern diagram of this group, we also can see in which countries and how many we have. This is a diagram we have from the Avadainu dataset. And we see in which countries they have their oldest known genealogy information. So this is the first version of the analysis of STRs. If we go into more detail, we will see that there's somewhat more complexity. We have dealing complexity with palindromes, which means that we have certain values where there's not just one number, but there are 2 numbers or 4 numbers, and they can change in a different way. Sometimes we don't have a mutation of 12 to 13, but suddenly from 12 to 16. And that complicates somewhat in the analysis, but it's good to be aware of that. So there are a set of tiny details, which is good to know if you really want to make a step further in the analysis. Now go to the second set of mutations, which is called SNP. SNP mutations, and I'll show you the same diagram. And now I'll show you what a SNP mutation is. Previously we had this AGAT, where we went from 12 to 13. And in this case, I'll show you a SNP mutation, and it looks like this. Now, probably you didn't see much. So I'll indicate again where the mutation is. Here we had a T before, and now it's a G. Now, This is one mutation in these 15 million positions, but the DNA analysis is so good now that we can measure this and we can find it. If there's one mutation, even if it's a mutation that was not yet found in anybody else, and you're the first one to have this mutation, it can be measured. So what are the characteristics? Such a SNP has a name. In this case, it's Y6923. It has a position on the Y DNA. This is a large number. And it's indicated in what direction the mutation went. In this case, it went from T to G. So this is the identity of this mutation, of this SNP mutation. Now, if a mutation took place, for example, 2,000 years ago, well, then it is given to all mainline descendants. So this is very nice because that's a very nice way of measuring who descends from which person who lived 2,000 years ago. Now, we don't exactly have this 2,000 years ago, but we do know that on average, we have one mutation in 80 years. Now, it's not a clock. It doesn't repeat every 80 years there's a mutation. But if we have a large amount of people, like we had in the example of this Ashkenazi branch, this way of measuring works very well, because the average of the whole group is this value of 80. Now, what's the other nice thing is that this, for example, if we have here a mutation of about 2,000 years ago, and this person who lived at that time has 3 male line descendants, and each of these lines had another mutation because it's another location of this on this Y DNA. Then the people who are descending here will have both this mutation and that mutation, and the people who are descending from this line, they have this mutation and they have also this mutation, but not the other two. And here we have a third lineage in this example. So it helps us to find nice the relation between father and different male sons. And we don't, since it's 1 in 80 years, we don't know in this case whether they are really sons, they are really brothers, or these two still have one brother, but the mutation was a little bit later. But we do know that they are roughly at the same time. The branch was split in 3 lineages. Now, in this example, I go into this FT2333 as an example. And what we see here, we have 2 persons where this marker was measured. One person registered to have an origin in Mexico, and the other one in Peru. And from this marker, these 2 persons have a set of markers they share, which is this group. It's about 15 markers. And only these 2 persons share these markers. So there was a period that these 2 persons had a shared ancestor. And then going further back in time, we have somebody who has other descending lineages. So we have some idea about this time period. We also have some information about the time period of this last period, because these 2 persons both of them had private SNPs, which means this person has a set of mutations and this person has a set of mutations, and the average of the 2 was 8. So this was roughly in the calculation going back to shared ancestors of 1100 in the Common Era. And then this older split was about 150 in the Common Era. These values are approximate, and we can do some statistical work on it to say how accurate or how inaccurate they are, but it gives a good idea. Then, in this case, I'd like to show you, because I think it's a nice example. I go back again to this Y6923. It's the ancestor, lived about 100 in the year 100 CE. And here we have this lineage of this Peruvian and Mexican descendants. Now here we have another, here is the ancestor going back in time, and here we have all these descending lineages. From this time we have another descending lineages of a Turkic person and a French person, and here we have a person who did not indicate where he comes from. And from this point on, this person, 6940, we have a start of an Ashkenazi branch. We know that this is a Sephardic branch. And this is people who have an Iberian origin, Peru and Mexico. This person is a start of an Ashkenazi branch. And here you see all these Ashkenazi people. Some didn't indicate their country, but the other ones are all flags of Eastern European countries and Ashkenazi countries. I go down in the diagram, and then you see how many descending Ashkenazi in this branch were measured. And as you see, that's lots of Polish and Ukrainian. And you also see that many of them, all of this grouping, remained in that area for a long period. And as you see, there are so many that I really have to go further down to see all these lineages. Here we have somebody who went to Southern Africa. And here we still have some people from Ashkenazi countries. And then here at the end, we have another branch splits, which are also Sephardic lineages. Here's Libya, Turkey, and these are also Sephardic lineages. So here we see that this large Ashkenazi branch has descendants in the Ashkenazi countries. There were hardly any migrations from one to the other countries. Probably there were some, but in the statistics we find a very, 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 very tiny percentage. So we hardly ever find them. And we do know that in this period before, they did have a shared ancestor. Now, to get some idea about, I want to say something about population growth, and I want to say something about the basics. So I use some simple models, and I'll tell you about two simple models. One, having no growth. What does it mean to have population with no growth? And then I'll say something about a stable growth, and I'll show you some models. In this first example, I'll show you what happens if we have an island and we have a limited set of food, and knowledge is not changing. So in this island, the man lived with his wife on an island for 6 generations. And the island, he had food for only 4 families. So we start with an ancestor, and he had 4 sons. And these 4 sons lived on the island. And then the next generation, it's a little bit a coincidence whose son will survive. So in this case, we have 2 which have 1 son, 1 who has 2 sons who survives, and the third one doesn't have a surviving son. There's only food for 4, so this is what happens. And then the next generation, in this case, we have an example where everybody has a son who survives. And then sometimes you have a situation where 3 of 1 survives, and the other ones have no sons. And this is a random process, of course. Who will survive and who will not. And this is an example of these 6 generations. Now, we only can measure at the moment these people who are still alive, so the people at the bottom. So it happens that if a person has no descending sons, we can't measure it. We have no information from him. So I'll remove him from the diagram. This person had no descending children, so I'll remove him. And here there's also one who doesn't have any sons. So we will have no measurements. So I'll remove the person because there's no data. And I'll do that same thing for here. So also, and here also, there's no descendants. And then here, there's also people, no descendants. This person also, no descendants. And then there's another one here. So although in history, on this island, there were always 4 families, in the Y-DNA, it looks like we have here one shared ancestor, and then here we have more people. But in reality, the population size was stable all that time. Now here, this is the way the nomenclature of the branches was given. So if there's a branch split, so we can measure SNPs, then we give them different names. So there's an A1 and A2 in this example, and we call them A2A and A2B. And this is a way of giving names to branches. Now here, what happens in the between, we won't be able to see difference because we only measure descendants. So if there were SNPs here or here, we don't know in which generation they took place. So we might as well take this line as a whole, because it's a period where we have no branch splits. So this is roughly what we now learn from the people who are still alive. Now, suppose it would have been a larger island, or first another example. Suppose these people would have lived there 140 generations. Well, we couldn't really tell the difference because we only see this last period. And it could have been that, and here whether it's 6 generations or 140, if there was no more food, we simply don't know. And in case we would have compared 2 islands, so we have another island here, same pattern, but suppose this second island was a little bit larger, and I'll make some values there. So we have a little bit more persons here, so there's more food. So we have more lineages here, and then probably it was an earlier time of the last branch splits. So this was a little bit earlier than here, which is simply the result of more people. But again, it's only at a certain time moment that we find this one lineage. Now, this is an example where on the left hand you see time. So this is 40,000 years ago, and here you see branches to present descending lineages. And only here, 20,000 years ago, you see a first branch split. And it's likely that in this area there was no strong increase of knowledge. And the pattern we see here is just the result of lineages dying out because of the normal random process of having children. In this case, this is the example of the people in Japan. For those people who arrived there 40,000 years ago and are still a large part of the Japanese population. And of course, in the recent period, much more happened, but for this period, this is what it shows. Now, if we have a stable population growth, we also have some values. Now, suppose there's a stable population growth of 0.02 in a generation, which means that the population grows with 2% in one generation. Nowadays, we the last few hundred years, the value is much larger, but in ancient time, this was a value which was not uncommon. In this case, we would have if this would be stable, it would mean that in about 1,000 years, the population would be doubled. Now, the fact that it's doubled in 1,000 years means that in this same 1,000 years, we would have one branch split, because it would be doubling of the number of lineages. So we would have one branch split in 1,000 years. And again, if in the next 1,000 years, both of the branches would split again, but both of them would do that in a period of 1,000 years. So that would be in a period of about 12 of these snips, because one snip is on average about 80 years. So we have a very long, narrow lineages in the old days because of this slow population growth. The other thing is that, as I showed you in the example of the island, it's only a small percentage of the Y lineages which is passed through to recent time. So in this case, about 2% of the Y lineage is maintained. And the other ones, the other 89%, which lived in the early period, has no Y DNA descendants. If this value is larger, not 2%, but 25%, so much faster growth, and this is a growth which is fairly close to the growth of the Ashkenazi people in Eastern Europe. Between the year 1000 and 1900, it would mean a double population in 93 years. So that would be in a period of 1.2 SNPs. So there would be many branch splits we can measure. And in this case, we have 75%, which has no Y DNA descendant, but it's very different from this value. To give another example of numbers, to get a feeling of numbers, this is an example with simulation of population growth in Europe. In this example, we have 4 million people at this time in a period, at the moment in time. But of course, if the population might be 4 million, but we have males and females, and we have parents and children. So if we count the amount of Y DNA parents who lived at that moment, this is about 870,000. But if we look at how many of these Y DNA lineages probably can be measured nowadays, that's only 19,000. So this gives some feeling of how numbers relate with each other. And that's also why we see just a limited number of Y lineages in the past, although the number of people was much larger. Now, in reality, we don't have this simple, stable growth. We have very different growth. We have tribal situation. We have tribes which are very successful in surviving. We have tribes which have no descendants because they were not able to survive the activities of other tribes. We have families which are well capable of taking care of growing up children. And we have families which are not as good as that. There could be a religion thing, healthy food, other things which could influence changes in or differences in population growth. And sometimes we have migrations, people going from one place to another. And they are conquering land to have descendants and food. And sometimes people have knowledge, so they can live with more people on a small area to survive. So in practice, this stable growth is not always there. Now, this is an example of what we know from history, in this case, the Netherlands and Belgium. And we do know that population grow differently in different periods. So here we have like a period of about 20%, and here we have a period where the population growth was 0. This is from historic data. Now, do we also have places where we know that we have this large difference in population growth? Yes, we do. The first example is the arrival and the growth of the people who brought the Indo-European language in Europe. This R1b and 269, roughly 3000 before the Common Era. They came to Europe from southern Russia, roughly. And now they are about 50% of Western Europe. But it's only one ancestor in 3000 before the Common Era who is the ancestor of this of this 50%. There were other people who lived in that area, but they have much lower population growth. So these people, their genetic distance, as we find in Y-DNA, is fairly small, and there are many of them. So this has an impact on what we can see on genetic distances. Same with this bride is also part of the group which brought the Indo-European languages. I1 is a Scandinavian group which grew as part of this arrival of Indo-Europeans. We don't know where they came from. It could be European, but could also be of southern Russia, but most likely European. But they joined in the population growth there. And here there are two groups which are in Greek, but also they also had a fast explosion of male lineages in a short period. In the Maghreb, we have a similar situation near 0 CE, Zero Common Era, which is probably more a family with a power position in the society there. There's also a group in the Middle East which had a far above average population growth. And another example of a fast population growth is the arrival in the Americas 12,000 years ago when they crossed the Bering Strait. And what do we see at that moment? Then we see an example which is roughly the same type of diagram. Here we have time. And here was the moment that people crossed the Bering Strait. And they very fast spread in the Americas. And then we have all these different lineages which arrived somewhere in the Americas, and they stayed very locally, and they didn't grow much after that in that period. So there was a short period of expansion, and later there was not much expansion. Now in the Middle East, we have a fairly early large diversity in Y-DNA. These are typical haplogroups, as we name the Y-DNA often. And this is both in Anatolia, in Turkey, in Levant, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And in that period, the mixture has been very large already in a fairly early period. Another good location to be aware of is that in Arabia, we have also a lower diversity where a large group of people expanded strongly starting this period, and well, after the Arab conquest, this expansion was again very fast. Now, if we now look to Jewish history, I'll show you a few of the diagrams we have to take care of. So we do know this is a common diagram. It just shown to give an idea of that this knowledge that we have of Jewish history can be used to see if branches fit in a history or not. So we try to find Y-DNA branches, and we try to see does it look reasonable, and often we will see that it looks reasonable. Sometimes it does not, and then we have to look into detail why is it different. And this is again a diagram like that. This is a rough estimate of population number of the Jewish world in time. There are serious uncertainties in this diagram, but it helps to check if data is consistent with other data. So in the Avtine project, we are searching for Jewish branches. And we do that in two steps. The first step is to collect people, and then we collect STR data, which is, as I said, is the cheaper version. We measure 37 markers, and it helps us to group people. So we see that people are close to each other. If they are close to each other, they are together in Y-DNA, and they are in a branch, and they have a shared ancestor. They have a shared Jewish ancestor. In some cases, that's not sufficient, and then it depends on how much money there is to spend. We can do a big Y test. or another test, but in generally that's the test which is done. And then we can determine an accurate position in the phylogenetic tree. Now that's a more expensive test, so we only do that if there's sufficient money and there is sufficient urgency present. But it helps to solve questions we are still remained. Now, the first thing we continuously do is new samples. We check in which branch are they. So that's the question we raise. And we also continuously re-evaluate the branches. So are they separate branches or are they together in branches? Now, what do we do if we have a new sample? We first looked, and a new sample in this case means this 37 STRs. We look what the genetic distances are. So how close are they to other things? And we first look from the viewpoint of the user. In the family tree DNA, a user can see if he has close matches. And close matches in generally mean that it's likely that they have a shared ancestor, but we're not yet sure. So we take it from the viewpoint of the user. So the same thing as the user sees in the family tree DNA, which is limited to the genetic distance. And in 37 markers, I think the maximum is like 4 we see. But we also take the viewpoint of the already known models of the known branches. So we compare them, this 37 markers, we compare them with all the known branches that we already have and see if there's a close match to that. We also check it in the Avatino dataset. There's specific tooling for administrators, and you can say, okay, determine the distance to anybody in your complete dataset. This enables us to, if the distance would be 7 out of 37, it could still be interesting. But it depends, of course, on other people who are at the distance. And then we sometimes use also samples in other projects, if that's possible, and if that's required, depending on the first 3 steps we have. Now, let me see. Yes, the star here had to do that we also take sometimes in account specific mutations which are not taken care of properly by family tree DNA. So we inspect all the details and where the mutations are and what STR. Now, then we look at what are the closest matches. And are the closest matches, are they people with a Jewish culture? Or sometimes they are people with other cultures. And of course, we're not always sure what a culture is, but sometimes we see that there are a set of matches and they have surnames from a different region. They have indicated where their ancestors came from. And that helps because in generally an individual can easily indicate an incorrect value, but if there are more people, it helps us to think of options. And then the next step we do after we've done these steps, we say what might be the cause of the genetic distance. And of course, there's always different options. One could be that there's a shared ancestor in recent time, but there's also a serious chance that there's a statistical chance of population of matches. In this example of this 50% R1b in Europe, where an enormous amount of people have done testing, the chance to have a statistical match is much larger than if it's from a lineage which is very exceptional. So both of these options should be looked upon to see if there's a serious chance that we really know if that sample belongs to a branch or is an indication of a new branch. Now, the resulting scenarios is that if it's close to an already known AB branch and it's close to already known samples we have, then we position it in an AB branch we already know. So it becomes part of a known AB branch. Sometimes we have if we have clear Jewish genealogy, but there is nobody nearby, then we define a new AB branch. So we define a new Jewish branch. If there is no clear Jewish genealogy, then we put them just in a separate part where we can look at later, but at the moment we see no sufficient reason to define a new branch. In some cases, we see surprising results, something we don't expect, and that could be because it doesn't fit well in history. Then we look into more details. For example, we look at the autosomal data to see if there might be something there which the person who reported to us doesn't know. That could be a non-parental event, and sometimes somebody could be not well informed. That's also an option. So we do several checks, and in some cases we are the information is fairly uncertain, or some additional information. So we take out the data set out of the group, and we say, okay, we can't put it in a branch at the moment because it's too uncertain. So we take it out. So we only define new branches if there's clear Jewish genealogy, and in some cases that that might be that it has an origin somewhere. The other thing is continuously we re-evaluate our branches. So now there are about 680, and we have different scenarios in case of interesting genetic distance. In this case, I mean interesting genetic distance is that based on the 37 markers, we are not always able to see if two groups belong together in an ancestor, because the quality of the data, this 37 markers, is simply not sufficient. We have an uncertainty in there. And in case of this uncertainty, sometimes if it's close, it's easy. If it's very far, it's also easy to not wait. But sometimes it's somewhat distant. And then we mark it as a possible join. And that means it's suitable for a SNP test. Because these are typical examples where there could be an shared ancestor 1500 or 2500 years ago, which is Jewish. So it could be an interesting subject. So these are suitable for SNP testing. Sometimes we have additional data where it's clear that some branches which previously were separated, and then we find Jewish people who are in between in their STR values. So we, at some point, it could be sufficient knowledge that we say, okay, these branches should be joined. And in case we do have SNP data, then it's always clear. It's either joining or separate. So then we know whether it's one branch or there are really two branches. We do regular checks. So we do a check of the haplogroup distribution in countries. So for all of the countries where we have samples, we check what's the distribution of the haplogroups. We have a look at geographic distribution. So we look at one branch and we say, okay, where is it distributed? Does it fit the history pattern? And if it does not fit, it could mean that it's something which we were not yet aware of happened in history. That's possible, but it's also possible that some data should be reanalyzed and has incorrect information. So we also sometimes check alternative scenarios if more data comes in. As I said, sometimes we look at the autosomal data. Very often, the different Jewish groups have clearly examples of endogamy. Of course, the Ashkenazi example is extremely strong, but also in the other groups, we see it's very clear that endogamy is strongly present in most of the Jewish groups. We look at what the diversity in countries is. So we look at a country and we see, is the variability of the haplogroups and the number of people, does it seem reasonable? And sometimes we see exceptional samples, and we make contact. We've had a few examples where we saw that there were Muslims who were being part of a Jewish lineage. So we made contact, and in a few of those examples, they confirmed that according to family tradition, they knew they had Jewish ancestry. And even some examples which went back to like 1200, 1300, but the family still knew, or at least they said they had this information in the family still present. So this is what we do to group people in Jewish branches. Oh, this was the other way around. This was my thanks sheet.
Thank you very much. Do you want to close your PowerPoint, and then we can
sure.
questions? May I ask, and I'm not sure if I can, because I suspect you've got sort of papers being published, but how similar are different Sephardic subgroups? That's to say, sort of Western Portuguese Sephardim with the community that went to Morocco, with the community that went to the Ottoman Empire. Are they very different or quite similar?
They're quite similar.
Okay. Are you able to tell roughly what percentage of that population had ancestry that might originally have come from Israel, and what percentage might have been local at some point?
Well, I don't have the exact numbers at the moment. It looks like the majority is originating in the area which I indicated as this this mixture of branches in the Middle East. And of course that means that what we see of people taking the Jewish religion in Western Europe and in Morocco, those percentages are small, but I cannot discriminate from this data whether a certain branch originated in Israel or in Anatolia, for example.
Yeah. And is it possible to say that because you were showing how certain Y lineages died out over the years, is it possible to say that what we have now is representative of what might have existed a few thousand years ago, or is it just totally different?
I don't quite understand the question. I mean, there of course there was mixture in between. So some lineages were added from local communities.
Yeah.
But that's a minority from what we see.
Okay.
And then there was certain branches which expanded much more than other branches.
Yes.
So that also has some impact in the ratio of different branches, but we see no big difference whether branches went to Morocco or Iberia or the Ashkenazi countries. It looks like that's a random migration.
Thank you. And I remember seeing an article which was talking about deer in Germany, and deer populations apparently still recognize the old border between east and west, so their patterns, they'll each stick in their own territories. And you've spoken quite a bit about looking at countries. Are you looking with respect to modern borders or with respect to old borders? That's to say, sort of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so forth, or is that just not relevant at all?
What I've grouped them at the moment on model maps, because that's what people often indicate. So that's how we map them. But of course, the the distribution of Jewish people was strongly influenced by the different countries in the past, and
Yes.
that's also what we see. That's also why we see such a high population growth in this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth area.
Thank you. Tom, do you have a question? You're muted, Tom. Tom, you are still muted. Francis, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Yes, I'm sorry. I just feel very ignorant, but very fascinated by this because I come from a very old family, but it's probably older than 1492. I mean, how before Christ, the pre-Christian era, whatever we want to call it, how did they communicate with each other? Say 3000 BC. I've been looking at Stonehenge a lot, and I began to wonder if any of them had popped through to Stonehenge. Were they all communicating? They were communicating on foot a lot, weren't they? But what were they writing? What were they saying? And how did they know they were Jewish? Some of them, and if there were groupings and collections of them all over the place, how was the identification made? And were they writing it down? I'm sorry, I'm very ignorant.
Yeah. For many of these people who came at that time, we don't know what they didn't write, and
No.
we have no sound of what they spoke.
No.
But we do see that that their DNA at a certain moment in time was arriving in Europe, and it was very similar in the autosomal data as from an area in southern Russia.
Yes.
And this fits in all elements of the arrival of this Indo-European language. So I know it also fits in the pattern of distribution of this Y-DNA, also in the fast growth of this specific Y-DNA lineage. And there's in that group, there was lots of old DNA measured. So there were several locations in the ancient DNA which were well measured, and they could see that at a certain moment in time, they had this new DNA arriving in Europe.
Right. But did they know they were Jewish?
No.
They didn't.
No, and we don't know. Those people probably were not Jewish.
And it maybe didn't matter very much at that point. I mean, they must have been at Stonehenge then, probably. They probably all were there any in England? Were any of these DNA groupings in England?
In the Stonehenge period, there was no indication of any Jewish people in England. No.
Oh, right. Okay. It's fascinating. I'm uncomprehending, but loving it. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question.
It's
Are you
amazing.
still looking for participants in the project? And do you feel that there are countries that are underrepresented in your research?
It's good if Adam answers.
I can't be seen, but I think I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay. So the answer to the last question 1 minute ago about England is there were no Jews before 3,000 years ago anywhere in the world. And so what you were talking about when you talk about Stonehenge, you're talking about populations that lived before the advent of Judaism. So there's no point in that conversation can't even be had. So what Wim is looking at is defining lineages since the advent of Judaism, which is approximately 3,000 years ago. And so he's looking at populations today that identify as Jewish, that have some historical claim to that, whether it be in Yemen or in Morocco or in Europe, and trying to divine who were the ancestors who were living at the time of the foundation of Judaism. And can we establish whether those particular lineages were part of the founding population in Canaan, or were they lineages that found their way into the Jewish community in the last 3,000 years? We have found both in every population that we've looked at, whether it's from China all the way to Morocco. There's always a combination of founding lineages from Canaan and lineages that joined in over the last 3,000 years. That's the case everywhere. Yeah. And one of the points is each one of us has that Y, each male has a Y chromosome that fits into the pattern of 680 lineages that Wim described. We have that one, but if you're an Ashkenazi, for example, it is very likely that in your ancestry, you have every one of those Ashkenazi lineages, because we've been marrying each other and having children together for 1,000 years. Now, the last question is, are we testing further? We are testing very actively, and we are very interested in the Western Sephardi community, of which many of you descend. And we're going to talk about that specifically at a talk in London this summer at the IHAGS conference. I believe our talk has been accepted to talk about the descendants of the Portuguese and Iberian Jews. So Western Sephardi is a major priority for us. A lot of the families on this group we've tested, and thankfully, and we're also very interested in Yemen. There's another community where we've under-tested. Our goal is to test 150 men from 150 different families in each Jewish community worldwide. So we've met our goal largely in most countries. We've exceeded our goal in countries like Iraq and Morocco, where we've had very active recruitment. But Yemen is of great interest to us. And Kurdistan, northern Iraq, is of great interest to us. And we're continuing to test in the Balkans. It's another area where we've under-tested, because we're finding that the Balkan community is very fascinating and very ancient. So that's a very long-winded answer to a very short question, but I hope I did my best. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Wim. That was a great talk.
Yeah, I think there were a few areas where we also discussed previously. We still need some more people, like Georgia.
Yes, yes.
And Ethiopia, I think.
Yes, definitely. We're looking for the transitional areas. You know, we're very good in the large settled regions, but there are certain transitional areas where we find people who represent an area that's separated, or was common to two separate areas. So, for example, in Kurdistan, we're finding men from China, okay, and in Yemen, we're finding ancient Kohen lineages, and so we're looking for these transitional areas, and that's very important to us. In addition, the Western Sephardi is really interesting to us because, you know, that we're describing the exile that began after 1391 and finding the connections among the different Sephardi regions around the world. That's it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is there, some of this is a bit confusing to me. Is there a way to look at someone's DNA? I have a person who recently posted their DNA and we are definitely related. Is there a way to look at DNA and tell how far back the common ancestor is?
Yes, approximately, yes. And of course, then there's always the question of, are you looking for the shared ancestors in Y chromosome?
Y chromosome.
Yeah, okay, that can be determined, and it has this statistical uncertainty. Yeah, so like we have this SNP once on average 80 years, but sometimes it's 40 and sometimes it's 120. So there is uncertainty in there, but still there is an approximate determination of a shared ancestor. Yes.
Okay. Right. I mean,
Thank you. We also have a question.
Once more, could you re-explain the absence of women? I didn't quite get it.
It's a different study.
Oh,
It's a completely different study, and it has different markers, and the time characteristics are very different. So Wim described before that we only have 16,000 places to look for differences among women, while we have 15 million places to look for differences among men. So that's basically, but that's a different study, and Wim is working on it.
Yeah.
And there's a question in the chat. What Y-DNA test do you recommend to trace Sephardic lineage? FTDNA, Big Y700, Nebula, and the other?
Well, in principle, the tests are very similar. But the interesting thing comes if you want to compare it with other people. And at the moment, the family tree DNA is the best location because it has the largest amount of Jewish people measured. And at the moment, the Y full is still very suitable to upload because there are several samples which are not in the family tree DNA. But to compare it with other people, the family tree DNA is the best location at the moment for Jewish people.
Thank you.
We also had a question about disease, which can be quite a difficult subject. Does the presence of Jewish genetic disease help spotlight data? I suppose that carries the assumption that there is such a thing as a Jewish genetic disease, which I suppose perhaps some things like sickle cell anemia, perhaps.
Yeah, well, it is not related to the Y-DNA.
Yes.
So in that sense, it's a different subject. It is related to the autosomal DNA, and it is related to the fast population growth, and that results in some exceptional characteristics which are spread in a much larger percentage than in groups which have a slower population growth.
Yes. And another question, is there evidence of increased mutations during the most active period of nuclear weapons testing?
Not that I am aware of, no. So the answer is I don't know.
Okay, so sort of no Godzillas floating around. So far, I mean, is there sufficient data to answer sort of historic questions? For example, we always hear that Sephardim settled in the East Mediterranean, and our superior culture caused local communities to adopt Sephardic identity. I mean, is there evidence, for example, that people whose ancestors may, for example, have been Romaniot Jews would later start to identify as Sephardic?
I have not seen DNA data to indicate that. And
the answer is yes.
Okay.
Without any question whatsoever, we have families like Al-Hadef and other very well-known old Romaniot families that identify as Sephardi. There's no question about it.
That's and sorry, because it's such a fascinating subject. Do we see, for example, Romaniot and, for want of a better word, Mizrahi Jews genetically forming a single group, but just divided by language by the Islamic conquest, or are they different sort of groups altogether?
Occasionally.
Okay.
Occasionally, and it's usually during the Ottoman period. So we do see migration during the Ottoman period of men from Turkey to Iraq and Persia.
Okay, thank you.
Do you also see migration from Portugal and Spain later than 1492 to the Ottoman Empire?
Yes.
Thanks.
How many Sephardic Y-DNA lines have been discovered compared to the Ashkenazi Y-DNA lines?
Wim?
I don't have the number by head, but there are much more Sephardic lineages than Ashkenazi lineages.
I thought so.
And of course there sometimes it's also difficult to count exactly, because the example I gave on this AB007, which is a big Ashkenazi branch, it's one of the largest in number of people, but there are parallel lines which are Sephardic, and there are more if you look back in the earlier period, then there are more Sephardic lineages than Ashkenazi. But this AB007, if you look at the number of people, many people will say it's an Ashkenazi lineage. But that's what we look at if we look at the number of people now. So,
yeah. Well, I think that's a very important point, Wim. That's something that you really uncovered for us, is that the Ashkenazi lineages. I mean, if you have to sort of have to toss out the word Sephardi, because there's a misunderstanding of what the Sephardi population is. The Sephardi population is a group that became defined that it was different from the Ashkenazi, okay, who arose about 1,000 years ago. But prior to that, you're looking at a reasonably homogeneous Mediterranean Jewish community. And what I think Wim has found is that the Ashkenazim, to a very large extent, come out of the same pool of Mediterranean Jews that today's Sephardi and North Africans come from. Right, Wim? I mean, you're looking at, just looked at AB 6923, Y6923, which looks like it's Libyan, right, in its origin, or certainly North Africa. But after about 700, 800 AD, you see it all over Central Europe, and then of course Eastern Europe. And if you look at the people who were thrown down the well, which is another study Wim has done of the people in Norwich, that population looks Mediterranean. So that I think is the point. And then in terms of the number, Wim, I think if we define Ashkenazi versus non-Ashkenazi, because Sephardi is a very loose term that doesn't really work in a genetic context. I think you're looking at 5 times the number of non-Ashkenazi lineages. Approximately over 500 non-Ashkenazi lineages versus perhaps 120 Ashkenazi lineages.
Yeah, it's on that order. Yes, and then if you look, of course, the Ashkenazi branches, many of them have their ancestor, their first ancestor towards the Ashkenazi community. Sometimes in the year 500, or sometimes in the year 800, or sometimes in the year 1000. And for some of them, we have some indications that they probably passed the line of Italy. Sometimes it looks more like they passed the line of Iberia, and it's even likely that some of the lineages arrived later, coming from the eastern side in the Middle Ages. So it's not in their origin. It's not that they all came from one direction. They did find each other and going up together in this Ashkenazi community.
Neil Nahol has his hand raised. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Can you explain to us or tell us about the Kohanim haplogroup? And did you find some differences between the Sephardi Kohanim and Ashkenazi Kohanim?
Well, the one main Kohanim lineage distributed in all directions. So, and at some point, of course, there was a lineage which became a large contribution in the Kohanim. The AB022, which is the largest one, they came a large contribution to the Ashkenazi community. And in their DNA, they had some characteristics which had some mutations in the period between the first Kohen origin towards the moment that they arrived in the Ashkenazi countries. And in those mutations, they were strongly present, of course, in the rest of this Kohen group in the Ashkenazi community. But by itself, it's not different people. It's just different steps in history and different mutations. But as a people, they originate from the same group. If I talk about AB022, there was another lineage, which is also, there are a few other Kohen lineages, which are not this AB022, and they also have a Kohen tradition. But this one is an extremely interesting one, and I hope we will be able to publish an article on that to show the different details that we found in the last period.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
When will you be publishing, or will you be publishing over the years, or will there be one great big fat book about it, about your research? How do you plan to make your results public?
I'll do that in collaboration with Adam. So I propose Adam answers this question.
The answer is we'll be doing it over a course of years. We will be building a compendium of all our work, but I think it's unlikely at this stage. I think Wim probably agrees with me that every time the mail comes in, we find new amazing results. And I don't know how we'll ever be able to put it in print. I think it's something that's going to be online and evolving that we will maintain. I mean, Wim already maintains a superb site at jewishdna.net. And if you want to look into the brain of our project, you go to jewishdna.net and you can see the raw material that Wim uses to draw his conclusions about separate lineages. And that list is constantly changing as we learn more about lineages. So I'll give you one example. There's one lineage we've been working on that we just published an article about on the Coriels, and that we had probably 6 or 7 different groups that we didn't think were necessarily related to one another. And once we started doing SNP testing on Wim's recommendation, we were able to ascertain that these different lineages that looked like they were separate for different parts of the world actually descended from one family that lived about 2,800 years ago. So we're going to be constantly evolving and publishing as time goes on. That's the very long answer again to a very short question.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question on YouTube asking about the Jewish community in China. Has anyone there been Y-DNA tested?
Yes, they have.
Where do we think they come from?
We think they come on the Silk Road. I won't get more specific than that, but there's no question that they're of Jewish origin.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. No question. Question.
Another question here about claims of Sephardic lineages in Eastern Europe. I think it's probably something that's been discussed before, but somebody has asked this question. I mean, is there any genetic evidence showing that there was migration, say, post 1492 to Eastern Europe?
Well, David, we're going to talk about this hopefully in London in a couple of months.
Yes, no, I think so. Somebody is egging me on with a provocative question here. So.
I think the answer is yes, but it's been exaggerated.
Yes.
Okay. Basically, I don't think we have found plenty of evidence that there are lineages that came up from the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century.
Yeah.
With the Ottoman expansion, we see plenty of that. Whether they came from Spain or not, the jury is out. But as my general rule of thumb, that is, if you come from Eastern Europe and you think your family is from Spain, you're not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Have you tested any of these rabbinic lineages which claim to be descended from, Rashi and King David and everybody else?
That goes in the mythology.
Yeah, I'm sure, but have you?
I've been tested.
And?
Yeah, I have. I'm descended from Katzenellenbogen. Family tree DNA.
You know, Katzenelnbogen has been tested. Rashi has not, because he only had daughters, and I don't think the only one I can think of. There are other rabbinic. This fellow Jeff Paul has made a small cottage industry out of testing rabbinic ancestry.
Yep.
And other than that, I don't think there's been a lot of work on it. I worked on one on the Harlap dynasty, which was disproven. So it's not really our focus. Rabbinic genealogy is a field in and of itself, and not really our mission.
Thank you, because I heard some years ago from an Ashkenazi Elbaz, who are apparently an Ashkenazi, so Hasidic dynasty, who were very persuaded that they were of Sephardic ancestry, and I was
Elbaz is a Sephardi family who we've tested, but I would need to see that.
There are different Elbaz. There's a Hasidic apparently family called Elbaz.
Well, send us plunk down $79 and send us a kit, and we'll tell you right away whether you are or not.
Okay, I think these are Elbaz of Hungary or somewhere.
We can identify a Sephardi family as distinct, or a non-Ashkenazi family from an Ashkenazi family instantly.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ton, we've gone even further than we normally do, but if Wim is okay, has anyone else got any pressing questions?
Okay, then we'll wrap it up. Thanks everyone for watching us. You've come out in great numbers, both here on Zoom and on YouTube, showing that DNA is a very interesting subject, and that you are very interested in it. We thank Wim for his lively talk, for his many insights. I think personally I'll have to watch it again, so I will get the final points. And we also thank Adam Baum for jumping in and answering many questions. And thank you to our patrons who support us and make all of this possible. And thank you to our viewers on YouTube. And I see that Guillaume has one last question, and after that we'll wrap it up.
No, it was not a question, it was only uploading.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week we have Rabbi Rabbi Mock, and he'll talk about the Jewish community of St. Thomas, a Danish island in the Caribbean. Thank you, and hope to see you all next week.
Thank you very much.